Have you ever imagined being challenged by something you can't see, but that's there all around you, manipulating your perceptions, your actions, and even your thoughts? In a world where reality and illusion blur what's real and what's not, maybe you think you're in control of your life, that you can trust what you see and hear. But what if, suddenly, everything you know is a distorted construct? How would you know if the truth is really the truth? What if you were being manipulated all the time without even realizing it? This isn't fiction. This is what happens in an investigation where the enemy isn't a physical being but an invisible force, an unseen killer who plays with the human mind. If you're enjoying this idea and want to learn more, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like it, and leave a comment. Let's explore this enigma, where the mind is the battlefield and the answers are more twisted than you might imagine. Press play and get ready for the journey. I was sitting at my desk reviewing some old cases when the call came. It was a small town, a place where things rarely happened. The first death was reported, and it seemed straightforward at first glance. A murder, no big deal. But when the local police told me about the crime scene, something in their tone made me realize there was more to it. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, nothing typical of a homicide, just a body lying on the ground with no clue as to how it could have happened. As an investigator, you know something is wrong when there are no obvious explanations. And in this case, I was certain the story was just beginning. As I approached the crime scene, the feeling of unease only grew. The town was too calm, as if everyone already knew something macabre was about to happen. The strangest thing of all was that, in that town, nothing had ever escaped the attention of the residents. The neighbors were vigilant, and any suspicious activity was immediately noticed. But that night was different. The victim's death, seemingly unprovoked, seemed to have happened out of nowhere. But what intrigued me most was the absolute silence that hung over the place. It was clear this would be no ordinary investigation. I spoke with local police officers, and the word strange was repeated more times than I could count. They were perplexed, trying to piece together a puzzle that simply didn't fit. No one had seen anything, no one had heard any noise, no signs of a struggle. To the officers, it was a mystery, something inexplicable. But to me, it was just the beginning. I already knew something much bigger was lurking, just waiting to be uncovered. And no matter how much they tried to explain, this case was beyond their comprehension. I was ready to dive in, and little did I know what lay ahead would be far more than anyone could have imagined. While at the crime scene, a thought crossed my mind. What if this wasn't just a simple murder? As a seasoned investigator, I've seen cases that started out simple and ended up much more complex. But this one had a unique twist. Something was hidden there, something that even the initial evidence couldn't reveal. That's when I heard the first mention of what would become the biggest mystery I've ever faced. Have you heard of the invisible killer? By the time the second death occurred, the pattern was already beginning to form, but no one wanted to believe it. In that town where life had always been peaceful, the idea of an invisible killer seemed impossible, something like a campfire horror story. However, as the bodies began to appear, it became clear that something much more sinister was afoot. With each new victim, the pattern became more evident, yet still mysterious. There were no signs of a struggle, no marks on the bodies, or any trace that could link the deaths to a common crime. It was as if the victims had suddenly disappeared silently, leaving no trace. And it was this silence that disturbed me most. The most bizarre thing about all this was that the bodies appeared in different locations, as if the killer knew exactly where and when to strike, always without leaving the slightest clue. There were no security cameras on the isolated streets where the murders took place, and no resident seemed to have heard a thing. How could someone commit a murder unseen, without leaving a single trace? For days I sifted through the evidence searching for any clue, but nothing, absolutely nothing, indicated how these deaths occurred. A feeling of helplessness overcame me. I was beginning to understand that something much more complicated was at play. Theories began to emerge quickly. Some said the killer had an extraordinary ability to camouflage themselves, perhaps someone trained in disguise or invisibility. Others believed the killer possessed some kind of secret technology, something otherworldly, perhaps even based on a science we didn't yet fully understand. And as an investigator, I always like to look at things more logically. But the lack of any concrete clues was leaving me baffled. Something that seemed impossible was happening right before my eyes, and I didn't know where to begin. It was then, on a starless night, that I received a visit that would completely change my perception of the case. A local resident, someone who seemed to have the knows everything but never says anything type, approached me with a story that seemed absurd but also plausible. He spoke of an ancient folklore, something that had haunted the town for generations, the invisible killer, he whispered. In that moment, the idea of a simple crime transformed into something much larger, much deeper. But what did this man know that no one else did? That was what I needed to find out. The investigations began to take more disorienting turns as the deaths piled up. What had once seemed like a simple, isolated case now turned into a series of unexplained murders. The medical examiners were as lost as we, the investigators. No obvious signs of violence, no evidence that anyone had been physically attacked. The strangest thing was that the bodies appeared intact, with no marks of aggression, but with an aura of death so profound that it left a void difficult to fill. It was as if the very air around the victim had been drained, leaving only the lifeless body to be found. Each death was more baffling than the last. As a seasoned investigator, I tended to rely on details, clues, physical evidence, marks in the environment, but none of it added up. I went to each crime scene with an expectation I'd always been taught to find something, anything, but the evidence was nil. No fingerprints, no signs of a struggle, nothing that would lead us to the killer. A sense of frustration grew within me, and I began to question my own ability. Was I missing something? Was something obvious right in front of me? Something I couldn't see? It was then that I began to notice a pattern in what the victims left behind, a sense of disappearance. It's not as if death itself was the enigma, but what happened before and after it. None of the victims had a fight for their lives, and the most disconcerting thing is that the victims weren't even trying to defend themselves. The strangest thing is that they were in environments where they would normally feel safe, like their own homes or busy public places. Something invisible was touching them like a relentless, silent force. This didn't seem like an ordinary crime, nor one committed by an ordinary killer. Worst of all was when a team of investigators was called in to try to make sense of what was happening. I joined them, and what we discovered was even more disturbing. The killer left no trace, but something was happening. As if the crime had been, a sense of incompleteness gripped us all. And amid this growing frustration, the question no one wanted to ask began to haunt me. Was it possible the killer was invisible? Was he manipulating something to erase his own presence? The idea seemed ridiculous, but the evidence, or lack thereof, suggested the impossible. At that moment, as I tried to piece together the puzzle, the story the resident had told me still echoed in my mind. The legend of the invisible killer wasn't recent. In fact, it had been passed down from generation to generation like a shadow that never dissipated. It was said that many years ago, a series of mysterious deaths had occurred in the same town, all involving victims who fell defenseless, leaving no trace. As the legend spread, it took on the appearance of a ghost story, something to scare children. But now, with the actual deaths happening before us, it all seemed far more plausible than anyone wanted to admit. I remember how the local resident described the legend, an invisible being, faceless, formless, but with a terrifying power to eliminate anyone who crossed its path. No one knew where it came from or who it was, but all who believed the story said it operated in the shadows, like a presence you couldn't see but felt with your skin. Over the years, many began to laugh at the legend, calling it a local superstition. However, the victims' accounts began to follow a narrative that made the story more than a mere fable. What frightened me wasn't what the resident said, but how convinced he seemed that the legend had some truth to it. For him, The invisible killer was more than a story. It was an explanation, a way of dealing with the inexplicable. And deep down, I knew there was something more to it. The ancient story, full of fantastical and mysterious elements, began to intertwine with the evidence and reality in a frightening way. Could the killer be somehow connected to the legend? I couldn't ignore the connection. As an investigator, I knew that even the impossible deserved careful analysis. And now, reality was forcing me to face what seemed unreal. As I delved deeper into the case, a sense of inevitability grew within me. The legend of the invisible killer seemed to have taken on a new dimension. I wondered if people had heard more about what was happening than we realized. Could the current deaths be just a repetition, a modern update of something that had already happened? What if the story everyone thought was just a tall tale was actually an explanation for something our minds weren't ready to grasp? I didn't know, but I knew I was getting closer to a revelation no one was ready to accept. Soon after hearing the legend, I began to think of possibilities. The case was consuming me, and I knew the only way to solve it was to start with the evidence we had, even if it was minimal. The first theory that emerged was obvious, yet frightening. What if the killer had exceptional camouflage or disguise skills? This kind of idea wasn't new to me. As an investigator, I've seen people disappear in crowds going unnoticed. But this situation seemed beyond simple concealment. Something was happening, but what? The bodies turned up so silently that it seemed impossible for someone to be behind it in a normal way. It was then that the idea of advanced technology crossed my mind. Technology was growing at an alarming rate, and I began to think of something more complex, perhaps something we couldn't yet comprehend. Images of digital camouflage and invisibility devices we'd seen in movies began to make sense, but the question was, how could a killer use something so advanced and still remain under the radar? I'd seen cases involving sophisticated techniques, but this seemed different, much more refined. I was forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. We were dealing with something that defied the investigative norms we'd always used. But as I struggled to find a logical explanation, the feeling that the theory didn't fit grew stronger. The killer wasn't just invisible, he was acting like a shadow, something that moved unnoticed, but in a way that went beyond simple disguise or technology. As an investigator, my experience told me there were deeper layers to all this, layers that couldn't be ignored. I was beginning to convince myself that the killer wasn't just someone physically hidden, but perhaps something more subtle, more psychological, a master manipulator playing with the perceptions of both victims and investigators. The problem was that this theory seemed even more insane than the first. How could someone manipulate the perceptions of so many people? How could an ordinary human being possess such power? However, the fact that the lack of evidence made no sense at all began to give me a new direction. Most intriguingly, all the reports pointed to a sense of presence, but no other physical traces, as if the killer were present but impossible to detect. This theory took me to a point of no return. I knew the truth was closer, but the idea of how it would fit with everything I believed to be real still left me uncertain. I needed to investigate further, and the next step would be crucial. As the deaths mounted and a sense of panic gripped the city, the investigation took an unexpected turn. I knew that until then, we had been guided by vague clues and imprecise theories, but now the situation demanded a change of approach. With each new murder, a line of thought became more firmly established. This was no ordinary series of murders. Something bigger was going on, and I felt the patterns we were trying to find in the crimes were beginning to make more sense. It wasn't just an invisible killer, it was clear there was something more sinister behind it. At that point, we began exploring more extreme theories. The idea that the murders could be part of a ritual, a secret cult operating in the shadows, seemed increasingly plausible. The city, with its history of folklore and unsolved mysteries, didn't do much to dispel such speculation. Suddenly, everything seemed connected: the deaths, the shared fears, and the whispers about cults. I, who had always believed the explanations for the crimes were rational and scientific, found myself confronted with something that couldn't be easily dismissed with logic. Something strange was happening, and the evidence was beginning to lead us down a much darker path. As we dug deeper, the clues began to connect in disturbing ways. The murder sites, all isolated, began to make sense within this new theory. They were areas where cults could operate undetected, where the presence of other people would be minimal. The city, which had previously seemed safe, was gripped by an invisible tension, like a web of conspiracies spreading beneath our feet. As we investigated, I found ancient records and documents that suggested the existence of secret societies, some even with macabre ritual. The question now was, what did the murders have to do with it? And more importantly, how did an invisible killer fit into this scenario? I knew I couldn't blindly pursue this new path without considering all the possibilities. The concept of cults and rituals was a tempting theory, but still, what directly connected us to the killer? We couldn't ignore the idea that invisibility and control over people's perceptions could be a psychological trick, a device used to create a terrifying scenario. A part of me wanted to believe there was a more rational explanation, but with each new step I found myself drawn deeper into a plot that only became more complex. With the number of deaths mounting and the pressure to solve the case growing, I was about to discover something that would forever change the way I viewed the investigation. The tension in the city was becoming unbearable. People were starting to eye each other suspiciously, as if anyone could be the next target or even the killer themselves. I never imagined that such a peaceful town, where everyone knew everyone else, could transform into a landscape of absolute fear. Residents who were once friendly and helpful were now locked in their homes, avoiding going out at night, and conversations in the squares were filled with suspicion and murmurs. Everyone seemed suspicious of everyone else, and the more deaths occurred, the more paranoia took hold of every corner, every street. The atmosphere was oppressive. I saw parents distancing themselves from their children, young people avoiding going out, and shopkeepers closing their stores early, afraid of becoming the next victims. There was no longer room for normalcy. The city was being corroded by an invisible fear, something unseen but taking hold of everyone. One night, I stopped to talk to a resident, someone who had already lost faith in the investigation. He told me he no longer knew what to believe. For him, everything had become a nightmare. The murders, the constant feeling of being watched, and the uncertainty that hung in the air. He asked, "John, who will save us from this?" I could only stare at him, unsure of what to say. There were no easy answers. The most disturbing thing was realizing how the tension was affecting daily life. People were beginning to change their habits. Children were banned from playing in the streets, and couples avoided going out for nighttime walks. The city, once a place of tranquility, now became a landscape of constant anxiety, where no one knew who to trust. Even the police officers were starting to get nervous. They, who should be the pillars of security, were as disconcerted as the residents. The case was becoming something that defied not only logic, but the very essence of trust. As an investigator, I had faced high-pressure cases before, but this one had a unique characteristic. The fear came not from something tangible, but from something invisible, something that even the authorities couldn't control. The killer lurked in the shadows, but what bothered me most was the feeling that the true threat was more psychological than physical. And with panic spreading, I knew that if we couldn't solve this quickly, the entire city could succumb to paranoia. What would come next? Something was about to happen, something that could finally pull the city out of this spiral of terror, but time was against us. Amidst the growing chaos, the solution seemed to lie in technology. It was at this point that we decided, with the support of local authorities, to implement a more modern approach to trying to catch the killer. We knew physical evidence was lacking, but technology could be the key to understanding what was happening. So, we began using security cameras, digital tracking, and even movement monitoring software. I was skeptical that technology could catch an invisible killer, but at the same time, the hopelessness of having no more leads compelled me to try. Cameras began to be installed on the most secluded streets in the locations where the murders had occurred. The problem was that, even with all this technology, nothing relevant turned up. The cameras captured nothing out of the ordinary, and the tracking software detected no suspicious activity either. Everything remained silent, as if the killer were anticipating our every move. It was as if he knew exactly where we were placing the cameras, as if he were playing a game with us, or worse, as if he had some technological advantage we simply didn't understand. The feeling of helplessness only grew. I was beginning to doubt the effectiveness of our approach. Meanwhile, a part of me was beginning to think that perhaps the answer lay in something more ancient, something that even modern technology couldn't explain. But I couldn't abandon my commitment to technology, not yet. We needed a solution. In one meeting, we even discussed the use of drones, more advanced equipment, but something told me I was missing the mark. And despite all the resources we had at our disposal, the killer continued to evade the nets we were trying to cast for him. The situation was beginning to frustrate me, because the more we tried to use the tools of the modern world, the more we saw how he was right in front of us, almost as if he were watching us. The lack of results not only undermined our trust in technology, but also made us reflect on the killer's true nature. He wasn't just elusive or stealthy, he was playing a psychological game with us, perhaps exploiting the technology's flaws or even manipulating our expectations. One thing was becoming clear: whatever it was, we weren't dealing with a common criminal. I was about to realize that as much as technology was our ally, it wouldn't be what would lead us to solving this case. Something else, much more, was behind it. And worst of all, I was beginning to believe we were dealing with something technology couldn't yet understand. With each new murder, the only thing that seemed consistent was the location. I began to notice a pattern that at first glance seemed random. But as I investigated further, it began to make sense. The deaths occurred in isolated areas, far from city lights and where traffic was minimal. These locations were chosen with almost surgical precision, and what disturbed me most was that in each of them there were no witnesses, nothing that could be used to reconstruct the events. It was as if the killer knew exactly where no one else would be, as if he had a deep understanding of the city and its most remote corners. What was most disturbing, however, was that these isolated areas weren't chosen randomly. Some of these places had a history, a dark past, that seemed bent on repeating itself. I began investigating the history of these locations and discovered something interesting. They were linked to ancient events, many of which involved death and mysterious disappearances. Perhaps the killer was capitalizing on the symbolism of these areas, as if he wanted to make his victims part of something larger, something historical. This made me wonder if the murders weren't just an end in themselves, but part of a larger narrative he was creating. A ritual, perhaps. The idea that the killer chose these locations for symbolic, not just practical reasons, left me even more disconcerted. As we began searching for more clues, I noticed another peculiarity. In the places where the bodies were found, there were no signs of a struggle, but neither was there a sense of peace. On the contrary, a strange energy seemed to permeate those places, as if the city itself were marked by death. It was an ominous omen, and as this became more evident, I began to wonder, did the killer choose these places because he knew something in that energy would help him disappear without a trace? Or perhaps it was just part of an even more complex plan. What frightened me was that as time passed, these isolated areas began to feel more and more like traps, with residents beginning to avoid them at all costs. But even with all this, there was no escaping an uncomfortable truth. The killer was becoming more cunning, more prepared with each new kill. He was using the terrain, the history, and even local superstitions to his advantage. I began to wonder if he had a larger plan, or if in reality he was simply toying with us, testing the limits of our investigation. And as we got closer to a possible discovery, the feeling that time was running out took hold of me. I knew the next move would be crucial. But the question that plagued me was, where was he now, and where would his shadows take shape next? At first, the victims seemed to have nothing in common. They were of different ages, from different social classes, and none of them seemed directly connected to the other. This left investigators lost in a sea of possibilities for a time. But as more victims emerged, something began to stand out. There was indeed a common thread. Something that, even though the data and evidence didn't clearly point to it, began to form in my mind. All the victims were somehow involved in local controversies, whether within their social circles or in broader community issues. This caused the story to begin to take a very different direction. The most surprising thing was when I managed to access some personal records and discovered that several of the victims had been in some way polarizing figures in the town. Some had been involved in local political disputes, others had distinguished themselves with controversial stances on social issues. The town, which seemed peaceful and tranquil, was actually a breeding ground for internal disputes that no one else seemed to notice. This pattern made me think that the killer might be choosing his victims based on his own sense of justice, perhaps to silence voices that challenged the local order. And at the same time, it made me wonder if he was trying to establish control over the town by eliminating those he saw as threats. I couldn't help but wonder, what was he trying to achieve with these murders? If there was a connection between the victims, what was the message behind his choices? But even more intriguing was the fact that none of the victims had been chosen randomly. As an investigator, this told me there was something deeper going on, something that couldn't be resolved with simple logic. The killer wasn't just killing for the sake of killing, he was creating a narrative, a story he wanted us all to understand, but which we didn't yet know how to interpret. It made me question everything I knew about criminal behavior. This wasn't the kind of killer I'd encountered before. He seemed to have a purpose, a much more elaborate plan. The problem now was how to make sense of this connection. If I wanted to understand the motivation behind the killings, I would need to look at each victim and examine their relationship to the city differently. And the deeper I delved into these people's stories, the more I sensed something wasn't right. It was clear the killer was exploiting every point of tension in the community, using these divisions as a way to justify his actions. This led me to an even more disturbing discovery. The killer could be an insider, someone who understood exactly how the pieces of the social puzzle fit together. He wasn't just killing, he was playing on the fear and anger circulating among the people. As the deaths piled up and the city sank deeper into panic, a crucial decision was made. A secret investigation was launched. The local government, realizing the gravity of the case, no longer wanted the public to know how deep the mystery lay. It was no longer enough to try to find the killer conventionally. They needed something more, something that the local police, and even I, with all my experience, couldn't offer. That's when a select group of specialized investigators was called in to handle the case. I knew this was a risky move, but I also knew that if we didn't do it, the city would be engulfed in paranoia and distrust. The undercover investigation was staffed by experts in fields I had never imagined before: forensic psychologists, behavioral analysts, and even data analysis and cybersecurity technicians. The idea was that technology, in-depth knowledge of human behavior, and even advanced psychological profiling techniques could finally give us an edge. At first, I was skeptical. I thought these modern approaches were far from solving something as deeply human as this case. But as time passed and more deaths occurred, I began to realize that traditional methodologies no longer served us. The complexity of the situation demanded something new, something that would break the routine and break us out of the box we were trapped in. With the arrival of the undercover team, the focus shifted. Now more than ever, every detail was being meticulously analyzed. They began to look at the victims' profiles in a new light, searching for patterns that we, traditional investigators, had overlooked. Some of the experts began to hypothesize about the killer's psychology, suggesting that he might be choosing his victims based on trauma or complex personal motivations, rather than simply eliminating them randomly. At the same time, the cybersecurity team began combing through the victim's social media and other digital records, searching for connections that could give us clues about who was behind this. But what I didn't know at the time was that as the undercover investigation intensified, another darker truth was beginning to emerge. In discreet conversations with some of the new team members, I realized there were more secrets hidden within the case than I was prepared to admit. The feeling that something was hidden was growing stronger. Did the local government, which had called this undercover investigation, have its own reasons for keeping everything secret? And more importantly, was the entire city being used as a pawn in a game much larger than any of us could imagine? As the investigation progressed, the mood in the town grew increasingly tenuous. Suspicion was in the air, and with each new clue, more people began to be implicated. The frightening thing was that, as the deaths piled up, the invisible killer seemed to be infiltrating people's lives more intimately. I began looking at those closest to the victims, friends, family, co-workers, and even local authorities. The line between victim and culprit became increasingly blurred. Who could truly be innocent in such a small town where everyone knew everyone else? With each step, I felt the web of suspicion only widen, and what once seemed clear now became a veritable labyrinth. I could no longer trust anyone. What had once been an open investigation focusing on the invisible killer now turned into a psychological game. Some people began accusing others, creating a vortex of paranoia and distrust. The local police were divided, with some believing the killer was someone from out of town, while others believed he might be someone who had been there all along, someone who knew every detail of the residents' lives, as if he were a friend in disguise, someone who had infiltrated the community's deepest connections. This made me wonder, what if the killer was closer than we imagined, acting so subtly that no one noticed? As the investigation continued, I began to question the investigators themselves. Some questions began to arise. What if, among those helping to solve the case, there was someone involved? This kind of situation was not new to me. I had witnessed before how the tension and pressure of a case could distort people's perceptions, turning allies into enemies. That's when I began to have second thoughts about some of the people involved in the undercover investigation. Were they part of something bigger? I was beginning to believe that behind every gesture and every word, there was a much more complex enigma. The invisible killer could be just the tip of the iceberg. And what awaited us next could be even more disturbing. Suspicions were everywhere. Furtive glances interrupted conversations, and even small details that at first glance seemed insignificant began to take on enormous weight. The city, once a peaceful place, was now a minefield of suspicion. Everyone was a possible culprit, and the investigations became more a question of who might be the next victim of the system of accusations than of who the killer really was. Somewhere, hidden in the shadows, the answer lay before us, but at the same time, I knew the answers we sought might be closer than we imagined, if only we knew how to look more clearly. It was a cold, moonless night when a man entered the police station, visibly shaken. He approached one of the officers' desks and asked to speak to the person in charge of the investigation. When I was called into the room, I found a nervous man with a vacant stare, as if he were running from something chasing him. He introduced himself as a survivor, one of the victims who had been attacked by the invisible killer, but against all odds had escaped. No one had known of his existence until that moment, and when he began to speak, the air in the room seemed to grow heavier. His story was like something out of a nightmare, but his words carried a truth that made me doubt everything I believed possible. He spoke of a strange presence, something he couldn't see but felt constantly. He described how, at one point, a suffocating sensation overtook him, as if something invisible were all around him, slowly approaching. He tried to scream, to move, but his muscles seemed paralyzed. There was no one else around him, but he felt as if he were being watched. He didn't see the killer, but felt their presence so strongly that, to this day, he says that if fear could be touched, he would have touched it at that moment. For him, the killer wasn't someone hiding in the dark, but rather something manipulating the environment and his perception so subtly that he couldn't even understand what was happening until it was too late. This testimony changed everything. For a moment, I felt like I'd seen a light at the end of the tunnel, but it quickly faded. This man's experience defied any rational explanation. How could someone be attacked without being touched? How could something invisible cause so much psychological and emotional damage without leaving any physical trace? At first, everyone thought he was delusional, grasping for some explanation for the trauma he'd experienced, but as he spoke, something in his voice, in the way he described the details of the feeling of being watched, made me realize he was telling the truth. He wasn't simply searching for an explanation, he was sharing the impossible. And what intrigued me most was the feeling that, perhaps, he held the key to solving the case. This man's testimony not only shed new light on the attacks, but also opened up new investigative possibilities. Perhaps the killer wasn't a physical being, but someone capable of manipulating human perception. And that changed everything. Theories about camouflage or technology began to pale in comparison to the possibility that the killer was operating within the human mind, manipulating what the victims saw or, even more so, what they didn't see. This revelation altered the course of the entire investigation, and a question began to haunt me. Could the killer be using some kind of psychological power to wreak havoc on the city? We were now in unfamiliar territory, where nothing seemed as it seemed. The man's testimony wasn't the only one. In the following days, more people began to come forward, claiming to have experienced something similar. An invisible presence, a feeling of being watched, a momentary paralysis, but without a clear explanation. Each spoke of a personal experience that defied logic, something that couldn't be explained with the evidence we had at the time. The strangest thing was that although the descriptions were similar, the accounts varied greatly in detail. Some spoke of hearing footsteps, others of a sensation of intense heat, while others said the invisible presence seemed to be playing with their minds, making them feel as if they were in a nightmare. Each new testimony seemed to only complicate matters further, and I found myself more lost than ever, trying to piece together a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit. But what really disturbed me was the way the testimonies were beginning to intertwine. The sensations of fear, paralysis, and something invisible lurking in their bodies and minds seemed to be creating a narrative we could no longer ignore. These accounts began to raise a question that had been gnawing at me. What if the invisible killer wasn't something physical but a force acting directly on the victims' psyches? What if he was a master of mental manipulation, someone who knew how to control people's perceptions to the point of making them feel they were in danger, even when there was nothing physically threatening nearby? This theory began to gain traction, and the possibility that the killer was manipulating the victim's mind so effectively seemed to hold the key to understanding the case. As more people came forward as witnesses, I began to notice a new layer to the case. Everyone who had been attacked or who was directly involved in the investigation seemed to be influenced in some way by the presence of the invisible killer. Their behaviors were being affected, their perceptions distorted. Some obsessively investigated the case, unable to sleep, while others withdrew, unable to cope with the emotional pressure. There was something deeper at play. I began to question, was the killer not only eliminating the victims physically but also destabilizing them emotionally, preparing them for the final moment, as if it were a form of total control? The idea that the human mind could be so manipulated was both fascinating and terrifying. I knew we needed to examine these testimonies much more carefully, as they were providing us with clues about the killer's behavior. Something was being hidden between the lines of these stories, and while everyone involved in the investigation was beginning to buckle under the psychological pressure, I knew we had to act quickly before the killer, or rather this invisible force, took another life, and perhaps more importantly, before the city's collective mind broke completely. As the testimonies piled up and the clues, rather than helping us, only pushed us in increasingly complex directions, I began to question the nature of the crime itself. Could it be that the invisible killer wasn't a physical killer? The idea began to take shape in my mind. Perhaps, rather than a killer using camouflage or advanced technology, he was manipulating the victim's perceptions so profoundly that they couldn't distinguish reality from illusion. The deaths could, in fact, be a psychological murder, where the real victim didn't die physically but in a slower, more insidious way that affected the minds of those involved. And by killing people's souls, the body eventually followed. The concept of psychological murder wasn't new to me, but I never imagined a case like this could involve something so delicate. It was clear that the killer, or the invisible force, wasn't just killing physically, but was creating a mental prison for his victims. They were being pushed to the brink of madness, unaware of what was happening to them. Like a specter, the killer seemed to play with people's senses, making them doubt their own sanity. To me, this explained the feelings of paralysis, the distorted voices, and the images of absolute fear. He was cultivating a psychological torture, making them feel constantly on the verge of mental breakdown. And ultimately, this torture couldn't be seen, but it was enough to destroy them. As strange as it seemed, this theory seemed to fit perfectly with what I was discovering. The killer didn't have to be physical. He could be a presence, an invisible force that simply controlled people's minds. It reminded me of an old psychological study on mental manipulation, where a person can be led to believe they are in imminent danger, even when there is no real threat. Most disturbing of all was the realization that this psychological killer was not only destroying his victims physically, but was leaving an indelible mark on the psyches of everyone involved. Even I began to question my own perception of reality. We were dealing with something no one could fully comprehend, something far beyond any of our control. But what frightened me most was the fact that the invisible killer seemed to know exactly where and when to strike. He knew how to create fear, how to infiltrate people's thoughts and distort their perceptions. I was no longer dealing with a simple investigation. We were at the mercy of a force that knew how to play with human emotions. This made us vulnerable at any moment, and I began to realize that this was no fight against a common criminal. We were at war with something much deeper, something that was manipulating our minds and feelings in ways no traditional assassin ever could. It was at one of the last crime scenes that the investigation took an unexpected turn. I was scanning the surroundings when a police officer approached, holding something unusual. It was a machine, or at least it looked like one, but nothing like I'd ever seen before. It wasn't a conventional device, nor a simple piece of technology. It was compact, with exposed wires and a few panels bearing symbols I couldn't understand. Most disturbingly, it was strategically positioned near the body of one of the victims, as if it had been left there on purpose. What struck me was the sense that this machine wasn't just a discarded object, but that it had a much more sinister function, one we couldn't yet fathom. The equipment didn't seem to serve any obvious purpose. It wasn't a weapon nor a cloaking tool, as I had initially assumed, but as I examined the machine's structure more closely, I realized it was connected to something even more complex. There was a strange frequency that seemed to be emitting from it, like some kind of magnetic field or low-frequency wave. Something that could unconsciously affect the human mind. I knew that what stood before me wasn't just any machine. It was a device designed to manipulate victims' perceptions, perhaps even to induce the states of panic and disorientation they reported. This apparatus was undoubtedly connected to the unseen killer, and it was he who was using the technology to carry out his crimes. In one of the tests conducted by our technical team, we were able to detect a kind of distortion in the communication signals when the machine was turned on. What appeared to be a simple tool actually had the ability to alter the surrounding environment in a way that rendered victims unable to perceive what was truly happening. The idea that a device could influence a person's perception in such a way left me perplexed. But at the same time, I began to understand how all of this was connected. The invisible killer wasn't just a master of psychological manipulation. He was using technology to directly interfere with his victims' reality, as if they were living in an illusion created by this device. And this wasn't just mental torture, it was a way to control perception and ultimately eliminate any resistance from the victims. As we delved deeper into the device, a new hypothesis emerged that shocked me. What if the killer wasn't a single person, but part of an organization or group using this technology for some greater purpose? The idea of a plan orchestrated by a secret network with access to such advanced technology made me feel increasingly isolated. I was beginning to understand that this wasn't just any investigation. We were dealing with something much bigger than simple murders. And although the machine was partially destroyed, its impact on the investigation was profound. Now more than ever, I needed to find the origin of this device and understand who was controlling it and why. As the truth began to emerge, I knew we were on the verge of something big. Each piece of the puzzle was falling into place in a frightening way, and the mysterious machine we'd encountered only confirmed what I'd feared. The invisible killer wasn't acting alone. We were dealing with a network. An organization that used psychological manipulation and technology in combination to control and eliminate its victims. I could no longer ignore the magnitude of what was happening. It was one thing to have a lone criminal operating in the shadows. It was quite another to face a group operating with a meticulously crafted plan, with resources and knowledge beyond our reach. The night of the final showdown arrived without me having the slightest idea who was behind it all. But I knew somehow that I was about to face the one responsible. I had spent weeks trying to piece together the loose ends, trying to understand how each death, each sense of terror, each testimony fit together. Now I was about to confront what seemed like the culmination of a mystery that challenged everything I knew about criminal investigation. It was as if the invisible killer was challenging us, purposefully leaving clues just to watch us struggle to understand their true nature. I was exhausted, but at the same time determined to find the end of this story. When I finally found the center of the operation, it was as if a curtain had been pulled back and the truth revealed in all its cruelty. What I discovered was more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. The invisible killer wasn't just someone who manipulated minds, but someone who had created an entire network of people with the ability to use this technology to control others. These assistants were spread throughout the city, acting as invisible agents, manipulating their victims without them knowing who or what was behind their anguish. By the time we confronted them, they were no longer trying to hide their actions. It was as if they were playing a macabre game, testing us to see how far we would go to understand the truth. When I finally looked them in the eye, I saw something in their eyes that seemed far removed from a simple killer. It was the look of someone who believed they were doing the right thing, that they were in control of reality, altering it at will. It was in this confrontation that the pieces fell into place definitively. The invisible assassin was not a lone figure, but the leader of a secret group who believed they were carrying out a mission. They used mind manipulation and technology to shape people's perceptions, creating a world where control was absolute. And in that moment, when I finally faced them face to face, I felt a mixture of relief and horror. Relief for finally understanding what was happening and for finally having come so close to finishing what I started. But horror because I realized that as much as we had managed to capture those involved, the greatest mystery still lay within ourselves. How had this network of mind manipulation formed, and what else were they planning for the future? The moment I finally revealed the killer was both satisfying and disturbing. I expected to see a familiar face, someone somehow easy to identify, but what I found was quite different from what I imagined. The invisible killer wasn't a being with distinct features, but someone who had disguised himself for so long, manipulating everyone around him, that he had become a shadow of the city itself. The greatest revelation of all was realizing that the killer had been there, right in front of us all along. He wasn't a shadowy figure lurking in the shadows, he was right at the center of everything, which made his presence all the more terrifying. His control over others and the way he had manipulated the entire city were the true instruments of his power. When I finally confronted him, the feeling of being faced with an invisible monster was overwhelming. He revealed himself as an ordinary man, someone everyone in the city knew but no one suspected. He was someone who fit perfectly into the routine, into people's everyday lives, someone no one would ever associate with such a grand crime. This was the most distressing part for me. Throughout the investigation, we had been searching for a killer who was hiding, and the truth was, he never hid. He simply manipulated what we saw, what we perceived, creating a veil of illusion so that we would never find him. This made me realize that the power of mental manipulation he possessed was far beyond anything I could have imagined. But what shocked me most was the motive behind his crimes. When I faced him, the killer revealed his motivations, and what he said made me question my entire understanding of humanity. He wasn't acting out of simple pleasure or revenge, but out of a distorted view of justice. He truly believed he was doing something necessary. He saw his actions as a way to correct the disorder in the city, as if he were purifying the souls of those he saw as failing. For him, the deaths were not just an end, but a means to a greater good. This revelation shook me, for it forced me to face a painful truth. Sometimes the worst monstrosities can be committed by those who consider themselves the heroes of their own story. As he spoke, I realized that however twisted his mind, there was a logic behind his actions, a logic he considered immutable and just. I knew I couldn't let him escape again. The truth was there, clear before me, and all I needed to do was make the right decision to prevent more people from being affected by his distorted view of reality. But there was something else that still troubled me. How had he managed to do all this without leaving a single trace? How had such a sharp, manipulative mind managed to escape our eyes for so long? The answer was closer than I imagined, and it could change everything again. The confrontation with the killer didn't end as I imagined. What seemed like the end of a long investigation actually turned out to be the beginning of something even more complex and disturbing. When he was finally arrested, everyone expected answers to come easily, that everything would finally be cleared up. But what happened was the opposite. The killer revealed his motivations coldly, calculatingly, as if he were telling a story he had written himself. He spoke with such conviction that for a moment, even I doubted my own perception of reality. He believed that by killing, he was doing something good for the city, for the people. He was convinced he was purifying everyone's soul, ridding them of their flaws and weaknesses. The tragedy, however, lay not only in the number of lives lost, but in the way he shattered the morality of everyone around him. Each death was more than a simple murder. He wasn't just taking the lives of his victims, he was shaping the city in his own distorted image, a city of fear and control. When I looked at him, I realized that the greatest tragedy of all was that he didn't see his own behavior as wrong. He believed he was delivering justice as if his vision were absolute, and anyone who opposed him was somehow tainted. This was the moment that truly shook me. The killer wasn't just a man with the power of mind manipulation, he was someone who in his mind was saving the world. But the real tragedy unfolded after his capture. While the city breathed a sigh of relief, a shadow of doubt lingered. How could someone be so out of touch with reality? How had he reached this point where the killings had become a tool for his own distorted view of morality? The killer, now behind bars, still seemed to believe his actions were justifiable. He continued to assert that he was not wrong, that everything he did was for the greater good. This left the entire city in a state of uncertainty. The true impact was not only on the victims, but on the city as a whole, which was divided, with those who believed he should be punished and others who questioned whether his actions, however monstrous, had a reason, a hidden logic that no one could understand. The tragic end of the case was not just the downfall of a killer, but the loss of something deeper, trust in order and justice. As an investigator, I began to wonder if, on some level, this case wasn't a reflection on society's failings. Perhaps the real question wasn't how to catch the killer, but how did we get to this point? How did we allow someone to lose themselves so badly? Even with his arrest, the city would never be the same. And as an investigator, I knew that the legacy of the invisible killer would remain with me forever. The only thing left was to try to rebuild what was left, but with the knowledge that the scars of this tragedy would never be erased. Although the case concluded with the killer's arrest, the truth is that the city was never the same. What began as a simple series of mysterious murders became one of the greatest psychological and technological enigmas in modern history. The questions kept arising. How did he manage to manipulate so many people, including me, the investigator? How was it possible to use the human mind as a weapon, distorting reality so much that the victims found themselves lost in a world where they could no longer trust their own senses? The case left us with more questions than answers, more mysteries than explanations. The feeling that there was something greater and yet to be revealed loomed large, and the city lived with the weight of this legacy for years. The man known as the Invisible Killer became a symbol of all that can go wrong when the line between reality and illusion blurs. The mystery lay not only in the killer's identity, but in the very nature of the mental manipulation he had orchestrated. The idea that the human mind could be influenced so profoundly, so relentlessly, left an indelible mark on everyone involved. The city, now more suspicious and cynical, tried to heal, but something would never be the same. The streets, once teeming with life, now seemed darker. People looked at each other differently, as if each of them might be hiding a secret deeper than anyone imagined. But as the city rebuilt, the legacy of this case continued to haunt me. The investigation had shown how one person or a group could manipulate people's perceptions in ways I had never imagined. Even after all the deaths, all the pain, one question remained: Who, after all, were the real killers in this story? The man behind the crimes? Or those who, with their actions and their silence, had helped create the environment that allowed him to act? The idea that the invisible killer was not just killing, but teaching a dark lesson about society's flaws was something that continued to resonate in my mind. And in a way, the scars of this case would remain with me, challenging my own view of what it means to truly see the truth. Now, years later, the invisible killer case is still studied as one of the greatest enigmas in modern criminology. Psychologists, criminologists, and even philosophers are trying to understand how the human mind can be manipulated in this way. Although the truth has been partially revealed, doubts about the depths of the human mind and the limits of perception continue to linger. The mystery will never be fully solved, for deep down, we all carry, in some way, the legacy of this case. A lesson we will never forget: reality is fragile, and the human mind is more powerful and more vulnerable than we imagine. Now that you've delved into this enigma and peeled back the layers of this investigation, tell me, are you ready to see the world differently? Because what we've learned here is that appearances can be deceiving, and our control over our minds can be more vulnerable than we imagine. How do you deal with your own perceptions? Are you willing to question what you see and feel? What happens when you can no longer trust what you've always believed to be true? This story of the invisible killer isn't just about a crime, but about how the human mind can be the greatest mystery of all. Now, if you're ready to tackle the deepest questions and discover how to apply this knowledge to your life, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Let's explore more mysteries together and understand how our mind can be an ally or a trap. Comment below with your thoughts on manipulation and perception. See you in the next video.